Some stories are more than just a journey. They are a battle for the truth. A story of absolute loyalty, of justice distorted, and of a dog who achieved the impossible. Today, we follow Garrett Cole, a former police officer who was framed and stripped of everything, his career, his honor, and even his freedom. But in his darkest days, one loyal companion never left his side, Koda, his faithful dog. Can a wrongfully convicted man and a dog who never gives up defy fate, uncover the truth, and reclaim justice? Join us for this emotional story. And if you love tales of loyal dogs, don't forget to like and subscribe to Dog Stories. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's dive into the story. The courtroom was heavy with an oppressive silence. No whispers, no murmurs, just an overwhelming tension as the elderly judge cast a stern gaze down at the man standing in the defendant's box. Defendant Garrett Cole, the court finds you guilty. The verdict struck like a bolt of lightning on a clear sky. Garrett stood frozen, his hands tightly cuffed behind his back, his sharp blue eyes reflecting an indescribable pain. A soldier, a police officer who had dedicated 16 years to upholding justice, now condemned as a criminal. His pleas, his declarations of innocence, drowned out by a trial that seemed predetermined from the very start. The jury didn't need much time to reach a verdict. The evidence against Garrett was overwhelming, or at least, that's what they believed. A USB drive had been found in Garrett's locker, containing video footage of him allegedly planting evidence to frame a suspect. A testimony from a former colleague claimed Garrett had accepted a bribe to alter the outcome of an investigation. Everything pointed against him, and there was no way to fight back. But Garrett knew the truth. It was all a setup. His eyes swept across the courtroom, studying every face. His former colleague, Warren Tate, stood near the prosecution's table, his expression stern, but his eyes refusing to meet Garrett's. A detail Garrett couldn't ignore. On the prosecution's side, Jordan Whitaker, the lead prosecutor, remained composed as if this were just another routine trial. But Garrett knew better. Behind that professional facade was something far more sinister, and then his gaze shifted to the back of the courtroom, where Koda sat, his loyal K9 partner. A German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, ears standing tall, and sharp, intelligent eyes. Koda sat still, never taking his gaze off Garrett. He didn't understand the courtroom proceedings, but he sensed something was wrong. He could feel the pain in his handler's eyes. In that moment, Garrett no longer cared about the impending sentence. What hurt more than anything was being separated from Koda. They had fought together, protected each other, saved each other's lives, countless times, and now he was being torn away from his most loyal partner, with no way to explain why. The court sentences the defendant, Garrett Cole, to 18 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers, but for Garrett, everything went silent. 18 years, he couldn't believe it. Garrett's mind spun. He wasn't afraid of prison. He had faced the most dangerous criminals, had stood on the razor's edge between life and death more times than he could count. But being stripped of his honor, convicted by a filthy conspiracy that ignited a fury deeper than anything he had ever known. A guard stepped forward, ready to escort him away. The cold steel of the cuffs dug into his wrists. "Wait," Garrett spoke. His voice was hoarse but firm. The entire courtroom stilled. The judge raised an eyebrow, signaling him to continue. Garrett took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "Before I go, I have one request." He turned, his eyes landing on Koda, his loyal partner still sitting in silence, watching him. "Let me say goodbye to Koda." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. No one had expected him to ask for this. But to Garrett, this wasn't just a goodbye. It was his last chance to touch the one friend who had never betrayed him. The judge studied him, his aged eyes flickering with a rare glimmer of understanding. After a long pause, he gave a small nod. 5 minutes. The moment those words left the judge's lips, a guard unclipped Koda's leash. No command was needed. The dog bolted, His claws clattered against the courtroom's hardwood floor. The spectators sat frozen in shock. And Garrett Cole knelt on the hardwood floor, his hands still cuffed behind his back. But he didn't care. In front of him, Koda, his German shepherd partner who had stood by his side for years, watched him with deep concern. Garrett lifted his hands as much as he could, running his fingers through the soft fur on Koda's neck, feeling the warmth of his breath against his skin. He had braced himself for the sentence, but he had never prepared for this, for saying goodbye to Koda. "I'm sorry, Koda." His voice broke. Koda let out a low whimper, pressing his head against Garrett's chest, as if to say he understood. The entire courtroom faded away. In that moment, there was only the two of them, two partners, two loyal friends. But then, Koda suddenly tensed. His muscles went rigid. His nose twitched rapidly, sniffing the air with an intensity Garrett had seen only in moments of danger. He took a deep breath against Garrett's jacket. Then, without warning, he clamped his sharp teeth onto the fabric and yanked, his body rigid with alertness. A deep, sharp bark rang out. The entire courtroom fell silent. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. A nearby officer frowned. "What's going on? What's that dog doing?" Garrett was just as confused. He had worked with Koda long enough to know one thing. Koda never reacted without a reason. If he was barking, if he was pulling at Garrett's jacket, something was wrong. Koda yanked harder, his sharp teeth gripping the fabric of Garrett's coat. This time he nearly tore open the inner pocket. Then, something small and metallic tumbled out, rolling across the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing clink. Every eye in the courtroom locked onto it. A recording device. Prosecutor Jordan Whitaker jolted upright, his face draining of color. A wave of tension crashed through the courtroom, thick and suffocating, like someone had just triggered a ticking time bomb. Where did that device come from? Why was it in the defendant's coat? A police officer stepped forward, quickly scooping up the recorder. He glanced toward the judge, waiting for instructions. "Play it." The judge's voice was low and firm. The officer pressed the button. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only static, an eerie, crackling silence. And then, a voice emerged. "Just do it. Plant the evidence. He's got a clean record. No one will ever suspect a thing." Garrett's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Warren Tate, a former colleague, a friend who had stood beside him through countless cases, a man he had trusted like family. Garrett felt his entire body go rigid. Tate had set him up. Then a second voice, rough, authoritative. "You're sure there won't be any loose ends?" Warren's reply came, confident and assured. "No, he'll go down, and once it's over we move forward without him getting in the way." A stunned silence swept across the courtroom. All eyes immediately turned to Prosecutor Whitaker. His eyes widened, his face frozen in shock. His fingers dug into the desk as if trying to ground himself. "Turn it off!" Whitaker's voice cracked as he shouted, panic creeping in. "That recording could be edited. There's no proof it's real." But no one obeyed. The judge leaned forward, his eyes dark and piercing. "Mr. Whitaker," his voice was slow, deliberate, and heavy with authority. "What exactly are you afraid of?" Whitaker opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, a silent storm on the verge of eruption. The officer holding the recorder turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that this court be adjourned, and the device sent for forensic analysis immediately." The judge nodded. "Request granted. This trial is hereby suspended until this new evidence is verified." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Murmurs and gasps filled the air. Everything had changed. Garrett looked down at Koda. His loyal partner stood close, his eyes gleaming with an almost knowing expression, like he understood that he had just turned the tide. Garrett still didn't know who had planted that device on him, but now he knew exactly who had betrayed him, and more than anything, he knew there was still a chance to win back his freedom. Just moments ago, Garrett Cole was a convicted criminal, a man abandoned by the justice system. But now, with the discovery of the recording device thanks to Koda and the damning words captured within it, The entire trial had been turned on its head. Judge William Harper sat silently on the high bench, his sharp eyes scanning the faces before him. He was not just a man of law, but a seasoned veteran, one who had seen enough to know when something wasn't right. He turned to the officer holding the recording device. "This device must be sent for forensic analysis immediately," he ordered, firmly. "We need to verify its origins before making any further decisions." But before he could finish, Prosecutor Jordan Whitaker shot to his feet. "Your Honor!" His voice was rigid, but the tension in his eyes betrayed him. "I object. This recording was never submitted as official evidence. It could have been altered, edited, or completely fabricated." Garrett narrowed his eyes at Whitaker. The first time since his arrest, he saw something in the prosecutor's face. Real fear. Judge Harper slowly tapped his gavel against the wooden bench. "Mr. Whitaker, you seem far more concerned about the authenticity of this evidence than necessary." Whitaker swallowed hard but forced himself to remain firm. "Your Honor, I simply want to ensure that this trial is not manipulated by fabricated evidence. This case has been closed. The defendant has already been convicted. A recording of unknown origin cannot overturn the results of an entire investigation." Garrett felt his anger flare. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a trial anymore. Whitaker was afraid. Judge Harper stared at him for a long moment before finally turning to the officer holding the recording device. "We will not make any conclusions just yet, but this evidence must be taken seriously. Send it for forensic examination immediately." "Wait." Another voice cut through the tension. "Warren Tate." He rose from the witness stand, his expression unsettlingly calm, but Garrett saw through it. The calm was just a mask. "Your Honor," Warren spoke, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room. "I agree that the recording should be verified. However, in the meantime, I request that the conviction remain in place. The defendant has been lawfully sentenced, and I see no reason to delay the execution of his sentence." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Garrett clenched his jaw. Warren was trying to keep the truth buried. He glanced at Koda. The dog still sat at his feet, sharp eyes locked onto everything happening around them. He had sensed something. "Judge." Harper slammed his gavel down. "Order." His gaze shifted to Warren Tate. "Mr. Tate, you testified in this case. If there is any indication that evidence has been tampered with or that foul play was involved, you will be implicated as well. Are you prepared to accept that risk?" Warren's lips pressed into a thin line. A flicker of tension flashed in his eyes. Garrett saw it, and he knew. Warren was hiding something. But before Warren could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A police officer strode in, his expression grim. "Your Honor, we have the preliminary forensic results." The air in the room grew razor tight. "The evidence is completely authentic. No signs of tampering or fabrication." The courtroom exploded. A shockwave tore through the room. Whispers turned into frantic murmurs, gasps, and even shouts from the gallery. Prosecutor Whitaker went pale. "Warren." Tate's fists clenched, his expression darkening. And Garrett, for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. Judge Harper took a deep breath, his sharp gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "With this new evidence, I hereby declare, this case will be reopened. Garrett Cole will not be transferred for sentencing until a full investigation is conducted." Garrett could hardly believe what he was hearing. He turned to Koda. The dog lifted his head, eyes gleaming with understanding. He had saved him again, but Garrett knew this fight wasn't over. The recording was just the first crack in the surface. There was a much bigger conspiracy lurking beneath it all, and now he had to uncover the truth before the real mastermind made sure he never got the chance. The door to the judge's chambers slammed shut behind Judge William Harper. He sank into his chair, his gaze locked on the case file in front of him. The room was so silent, he could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. In over 20 years, on the bench, he had never seen a case riddled with so many unanswered questions. The verified recording had turned everything upside down. But Harper knew this wasn't just about Garrett Cole. There was something bigger at play. Reaching for the intercom, he pressed the button. "Send Warren Tate to my office. Now." Outside, Warren Tate stood in the hallway, his face expressionless, like a stone statue. When a uniformed officer approached and informed him that the judge wanted to see him, a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and stepped into the office. "You called. For me?" His voice was steady, controlled. Harper leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced, studying the man before him. "Do you know why you're here, Tate?" Warren smirked slightly, a hollow, humorless gesture. "I assume you want to discuss the trial?" "No," Harper cut him off. "I want to know why your voice is on that recording." For the briefest moment, Warren's face went rigid, but he recovered quickly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your Honor, I don't know who fabricated that recording, but I can assure you, it's not me. I've been in this field long enough to know better than to get involved in a mess like this." Harper smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Do you take me for a fool?" His hands pressed firmly against the desk as his voice dropped lower. "The recording has been verified. It's not fake. You can deny it all you want, but that won't change the truth." A flicker of tension flashed in Warren's eyes, but he kept his composure. "Then who put it in Cole's jacket?" he countered, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. "We don't know who's behind this, but clearly, someone is trying to frame me." Harper didn't flinch. Without a word, he picked up a thin folder, flipped it open, and placed it in front of Warren. "There's something I need you to explain." Warren glanced down, and his breath caught. Inside the folder was a list of suspicious financial transactions, a series of wire transfers, large sums of money funneled from a shell corporation into his personal bank account, tens of thousands of dollars, and every deposit lined up perfectly with key moments in Garrett Cole's case. Warren froze. Harper didn't give him a chance to recover. "Where did the money come from, Tate, and what exactly did you do to earn it?" Warren's fists clenched tight, his expression darkened, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Your Honor, I think you're misunderstanding." "Is that so?" Harper's palm slammed against the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the room. Warren flinched. "I am not an idiot, Tate. I've seen men like you too many times. You might fool others, but you won't fool me." The air in the room thickened, suffocating under the weight of unraveling secrets. "If you have something to confess, I strongly suggest you do it now," Harper warned, his voice dangerously low. "Because when I bring all of this into the public eye, I guarantee you will have no way out." For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed Warren's face. He was trapped. But just as Harper thought Warren was about to break, the door burst open. A uniformed officer rushed in, his face pale. "Judge Harper!" His voice was tense, urgent. "Prosecutor Whitaker has disappeared." Harper froze. Warren Tate went rigid, and inside his holding cell, Garrett Cole lifted his head at the sudden commotion outside the courtroom. Jordan Whitaker, the IE lead prosecutor, the man at the center of it all, had just vanished, and that could only mean one thing. Something bigger, something more dangerous, was pulling the strings. Jordan Whitaker sat in the leather chair, the dim glow of the luxury hotel room's lighting casting shadows over his pale face. Just hours ago, he had stood tall in the courtroom, convinced he was in control. Now, he was a fugitive, his fingers clenched around the whiskey glass, his hollow eyes staring out the rain-slicked window. Below, the city buzzed with life, neon lights reflecting off the wet streets. But to Whitaker, none of it mattered anymore. His world was collapsing. He pressed a button on his phone, dialing an unlisted number. "I need help," he said, his voice low and urgent. The other end of the line was silent for a few seconds. Then, a deep, gravelly voice spoke. "You screwed up." Whitaker tightened his grip on the glass, his breath coming faster. They found the evidence. The recording was authenticated. Now Harper's reopening the entire case. "And you let that happen?" The voice snapped, filled with fury. Whitaker flinched. "I had no choice. If I hadn't run, they would have taken me down right there in court." Silence. A long, heavy pause. Then the voice returned, calmer now but colder. "Listen to me, Whitaker. This isn't over. You know damn well I won't let them expose everything." Whitaker swallowed hard. He knew. The man on the other end of the line, the shadow behind everything, was the real mastermind, and Whitaker was nothing more than a pawn. "So, what's the next move?" Whitaker's voice was barely a whisper. "We silence those who know too much." Whitaker froze. "You mean Garrett Cole, Judge Harper, and anyone else digging too deep?" "No." Whitaker shot to his feet, cold sweat dripping down his spine. "We can't. If anyone dies now, all suspicion will fall directly on us." "And you think we have another choice?" The voice on the other end was sharp, menacing. Whitaker held his breath. He knew the truth. If he refused, this phone call might be the last one he ever made. "Fine," he exhaled shakily. "I'll take care of it." "Good. I'm sending my people to assist. I want this finished within 48 hours. The call ended. Whitaker let the phone slip from his grip, his palm damp with sweat. He had just crossed a line he could never come back from. If Garrett Cole and Harper weren't eliminated, the entire network would crumble. But if Whitaker failed, it would be his turn to disappear. The night was eerily quiet. In the dimly lit underground parking lot of a high-rise building, two men exchanged something in the shadows: a gun, a dossier, a sealed envelope with detailed instructions. The man receiving the orders gave a slow nod before slipping into an unmarked black car and driving off. He had one job: silence Garrett Cole before it was too late. Inside the holding cell, Garrett Cole sat motionless, his gaze locked on the cold concrete wall in front of him. Koda lay at his feet, his breathing steady, but his ears were pricked, alert. Something was coming, and Garrett knew it. Even though the trial had been postponed, Garrett knew he wasn't safe yet. Out there, the person who had orchestrated his downfall was still free. Only when the full truth was exposed could he truly reclaim his freedom. The heavy metal door to his holding cell suddenly creaked open, pulling Garrett from his thoughts. A guard gestured toward him. "Someone wants to see you." Garrett frowned but stood up, instinctively resting a hand on Koda's head. The officer led them to a small interview room, where a woman in a police uniform was already waiting. Lieutenant Sarah Vaughn, one of the few people left in the force that Garrett still trusted. She looked up as he entered, her sharp gaze laced with concern. "We don't have much time," she said the moment the door clicked shut behind them. Garrett sat down across from her. "What is this about?" Sarah slid a folder across the table toward him. "I found this buried in the department's archives." Garrett flipped it open. His blood turned to ice. Black and white photographs, grainy but clear enough. They captured a secret meeting between Jordan Whitaker, Warren Tate, and a man Garrett didn't recognize. But what sent a chill down his spine wasn't just who was in the pictures. It was where they were taken. A private conference room. Inside the police department, Garrett looked up at Sarah, his expression turning deadly serious. "What the hell is this?" "I think your case is just the tip of something much bigger," Sarah murmured, her voice low. "Someone has been using the police system to cover up illegal operations." Garrett gripped the file tighter. "Does anyone else know about this?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. I don't know who I can trust." Garrett nodded slowly. He understood. If Sarah revealed this evidence too soon, their enemies would erase every trace of it before they could act. Koda suddenly lifted his head, his nose twitching. Garrett's instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah moved first. She shot to her feet, drawing her gun in a single fluid motion. "We're being watched." Garrett didn't hesitate. He swiftly folded the file, tucking it into his jacket before signaling Koda to stay close. Sarah moved to the door, pressing her ear against it before cracking it open just enough to check the hall. She gestured forward. They moved quickly, slipping into the quieter corridors of the precinct. Garrett could feel it, that creeping sensation of being hunted. But where was the threat coming from? They turned a corner, and a dark figure lunged at them. A man dressed in black lunged, a knife flashing in his grip. Koda reacted faster than anyone, a snarl, a blur of fur, then sharp teeth sank into the attacker's arm. The man screamed in agony, the knife clattering to the floor. Garrett didn't waste a second. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Who the hell are you?" Garrett growled, his voice edged with fury. The man thrashed, desperately trying to break free. Sarah moved in fast, twisting his arm behind, his back and snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "We'll get our answers soon enough," she muttered. Garrett stared into the man's eyes, and that's when he saw it. Fear. Not fear of getting caught, fear of something bigger, and that was more dangerous than anything else. He turned to Sarah, his voice low and firm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Garrett Cole and Lieutenant Sarah Vaughn sat inside an abandoned warehouse in the old industrial district. The dim light cast long shadows over the worn wooden table, where the confidential files Sarah had retrieved from the police archives lay, spread open. Even though they had barely escaped an ambush, Garrett knew this was only the beginning. He flipped a page in the file. Rows of mysterious financial transactions appeared on the bank statements, large sums of money funneled from a shell corporation, Ardent Holdings, into the personal accounts of high-ranking officers in the department, among them Warren Tate and Jordan Whitaker. Sarah pointed to another name on the list. "This goes beyond Tate and Whitaker," she said, her voice grim. "Look, at this name, Police Chief Walter Briggs." Garrett looked up, his expression darkening. "The chief of police?" If these documents were accurate, it meant that the entire police department had been compromised, from the very top. Sarah lowered her voice. "Briggs was the one overseeing your case. If he's involved in this, then your arrest might not have been Whitaker's doing alone." A cold shiver ran down Garrett's spine. "That means I wasn't the only one set up." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. They could have done this to countless others, honest officers, anyone who got too close to cases that threatened their operation." Garrett clenched his fists. If they could take him down, they could do the same to anyone. Koda suddenly stood up, his ears twitching. The German shepherd's nose pointed toward the small warehouse window, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. He had caught a scent. Sarah immediately drew her gun. Garrett held up a hand, signaling for silence. Outside, a black SUV rolled to a stop. They had been followed. Garrett moved fast, shoving the documents into a leather bag. There was no way he was letting this evidence fall into the wrong hands. "We need to move." "Now," Sarah whispered. Garrett nodded. They slipped out the back, moving through a narrow alley behind the warehouse. The moment they reached the street, a loud crash erupted behind them. The warehouse had been breached. Their pursuers had arrived. Without looking back, Garrett and Sarah melted into the city's crowded streets, disappearing before anyone could follow. Garrett knew. Right now, they were the most dangerous targets in the city, and there was only one way to protect themselves. They had to expose everything before they were silenced. Garrett Cole and Sarah Vaughn moved swiftly through the darkened streets, their pulses pounding. In their hands was the leather bag containing the only evidence that could unravel the deep corruption within the police force. But Garrett knew they were being hunted. Koda ran alongside them, his ears pricked, his muscles tense. The K-9 sensed danger. Garrett had learned long ago never to ignore his instincts. Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the black SUV trailing them. It didn't have its headlights on, but it was watching. "We need to lose them," she whispered, keeping her voice steady. Garrett nodded. They turned sharply into a narrow alley, vanishing into the shadows. Then, a sharp screech shattered the silence. Tires skidded violently against the pavement. Headlights flared to life, slicing through the darkness like a predator locking onto. "It's prey! Run!" Garrett yanked Sarah forward as they sprinted toward the alley's exit. But just as they reached the other end, a second vehicle cut them off. They were trapped. The doors of both SUVs swung open. 4 men stepped out, all dressed in black, weapons drawn. Garrett didn't hesitate. He pulled his pistol, positioning himself between Sarah, Koda, and the approaching threat. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, though he already knew the answer. One of the men smirked. "Mr. Cole, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We just want what doesn't belong to you." Garrett's grip tightened around the bag in his hand. They wanted the evidence. Sarah held her gun steady, lowering her voice. "We can make it out if—" Bang! A bullet tore through the air, grazing Garrett's shoulder and slamming into the brick wall behind him. They weren't here to negotiate. Garrett fired back instantly, his shot grazing the man who had pulled the trigger. The attacker cursed and stumbled, but the others kept advancing. Koda snarled, then lunged. His jaws clamped down on one of the men's arms, dragging him to the ground with a pained yell. Sarah seized the opening, taking out another as he tried to flank Garrett, but then a dark blur moved in from the side. A fist slammed into Garrett's ribs. The force knocked the wind out of him, his gun flying from his grip. Before he could recover, the man grabbed his collar and yanked him close. "You really thought you could get away?" The attacker growled. Garrett gritted his teeth, then drove his forehead into the man's face. The attacker stumbled back, blood streaming from his nose. Without hesitation, Garrett snatched the man's gun and turned, scanning for Sarah. She was still fighting, but they were outnumbered. Koda kept fighting, but Garrett knew they couldn't hold out forever. They needed an exit. His eyes darted around, then locked onto a metal door a few meters away. "Sarah! There!" he shouted. Sarah understood instantly. She fired twice, forcing their attackers to back off, then sprinted toward the door. Garrett scooped Koda up and ran after her, locked. No time. With one powerful kick, Garrett smashed the rusted hinges. The door burst open. All three of them rushed inside, slamming the door shut just as their pursuers reached them. A chorus of furious pounding erupted from the other side. They had bought themselves a few seconds. Sarah leaned against the wall, breathing hard, her hand gripping her wounded shoulder. Koda let out a soft whimper, looking up at Garrett, his amber eyes filled with concern. Garrett knelt down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "We're gonna be okay, Koda." But then, a voice echoed from the shadows. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Garrett." Garrett froze. A figure stepped forward from the darkness, Warren Tate, and the look on his face said he had been expecting them. It almost seemed like he had been waiting for them. Garrett Cole slowly turned, his eyes locking onto Warren Tate, the former colleague who now stood in the shadows, his expression unreadable. Sarah shifted slightly, tightening her grip on the bag full of evidence, her gaze sharp with suspicion. Koda stood beside Garrett, unmoving, ears perked, his entire body tense. He was ready for anything. "What are you doing here, Warren?" Garrett's voice was calm, but edged with caution. Warren took a slow step forward, exhaling as if this whole situation was a burden to him. "I tried to help you, Garrett, but you don't know when to stop." Garrett studied him, searching for even the slightest trace of regret in Warren's eyes. But there was none. Only exhaustion. Resignation. "You know I can't stop. Not when I know the truth." Warren dropped his gaze to the floor, then gave a small, I figured as much." For a moment, the tension in the room became unbearable. No one moved. Garrett knew Warren well. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. Given the chance, maybe Warren would have chosen a different path, but it was too late for that now. Finally, Warren sighed. "You need to get out of here, Garrett." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Are you trying to help us?" Warren shrugged. "I don't want to see you die, Garrett, but if you stay, that's exactly what's going to happen." Garrett stared at him, analyzing every word. Was Warren really trying to help them, or was this just another trap? Koda sniffed the air, glancing at Garrett as if even he wasn't sure about this situation. Garrett hesitated for a brief moment, then made a choice. One last gamble. "We need to get out of the city with these documents, but first, we need a safe way out." Warren remained silent, deep in thought. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I have a way. But you'll have to trust me." Sarah shot Garrett a wary look, but he gave her a slight nod. They didn't have another option. Warren led them through a side exit, guiding them out of the warehouse unnoticed. Moving through deserted alleys, they made their way into an underground Parking garage beneath an old building. A battered SUV sat in the shadows. Warren tossed the keys to Garrett. Go. Before I change my mind. Garrett held Warren's gaze for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, Warren. Warren simply crossed his arms, watching as they climbed into the vehicle. The SUV pulled out of the garage, disappearing into the night, carrying their last hope of exposing the truth. But the moment they were gone, Warren pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the line connected, he whispered just 2 words. They're moving. The old SUV rumbled down the deserted road, streetlights casting fleeting streaks of light across its worn-out windows. Garrett Cole gripped the steering wheel tightly, his gaze locked onto the road ahead. In the back seat, Sarah Vaughn rapidly flipped through the stack of documents, scanning every page for the real mastermind behind this entire operation. Koda lay still on the floor of the vehicle, ears perked and alert. He didn't understand the details, but he knew one thing. This was a moment that mattered. Then, Sarah froze. Her eyes widened as she stared at a particular page. Garrett. We were wrong about who's really behind this. Garrett glanced at her, through the rearview mirror, his instincts sharpening. Talk to me. Sarah held up the document, her voice steady but urgent. Police Chief Walter Briggs isn't the one pulling the strings. Garrett's brow furrowed. Then who? Sarah pointed at a name. Deputy Mayor Richard Langley. Garrett's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew Langley, a well-respected politician, always on the news, always speaking about integrity and justice. He had built a reputation as a man who fought against corruption, and now he was exposed as the true mastermind behind it all. We need to go public with this. Now, Sarah said firmly. Garrett nodded, pressing harder on the gas. They couldn't give Langley time to cover his tracks, or worse, silence them before. They got the chance. City Hall. 6 a.m. Garrett and Sarah moved quickly through the grand halls of the government building, their grip tight on the folder containing the damning evidence. They had arranged an emergency meeting with Judge William Harper, the only man with the authority to issue an arrest warrant for Langley without interference. Harper sat in silence as he flipped through the documents, his furrowed brow deepening with every page. By the time he reached the last one, he looked up at them, determination burning in his eyes. We need to act immediately. 4 hours later. Deputy Mayor Richard Langley's office. Richard Langley lounged comfortably in his expensive leather chair, sipping his morning coffee. He had no idea the walls were closing in around him. Suddenly, the office doors burst open. A team of federal agents stormed inside. Richard Langley, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and orchestrating criminal activities within the law enforcement system. Langley froze, but only for a second. Then, he smoothed his tie and straightened in his seat, his expression coldly composed. This is absurd. I have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Langley knew the game, and he knew he had lost. He fell silent as the agents moved in, securing his wrists in handcuffs. Outside the office, Garrett and Sarah watched the scene unfold. Finally, the corruption had been exposed. Justice had caught up to the man who thought he was untouchable. 2 weeks later, Garrett Cole stood on the courthouse steps watching as headlines flashed across newspapers and TV screens. Deputy Mayor arrested in city's biggest corruption scandal. Police corruption ring exposed. High-ranking officials involved. Justice has finally won. Beside him, Koda wagged his tail lightly, his amber eyes seeming to understand that the fight was finally over. Sarah stepped up next to him, a small smile on her lips. You did it, Garrett. Garrett looked down at Koda, then reached out to scratch, behind his ears. We did it. The journey had been brutal, but in the end, the truth had been brought to light. And for the first time in a long time, Garrett knew. He was no longer the hunted. He was the one who had won. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange. Garrett stood on his front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, feeling truly free for the first time in months. On the lawn, Koda lay stretched out, his tail flicking lazily in the evening breeze. No longer tense, no longer on high alert, just at peace. Sarah stepped outside, a folder in her hands. "Have you thought about this?" she asked, settling beside him. Garrett glanced at the papers, a formal offer to return to the police force as an independent investigative consultant. He smirked, but didn't answer right away. "You fought so hard to clear your name," Sarah pressed, watching him closely. "Now you have the chance to go back. Are you really going to walk away?" Garrett took a deep breath, his eyes drifting to Koda, the partner who had stood by him through the darkest moments. "I'm not sure I want to be part of that system again, Sarah," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. Justice isn't just about wearing a badge." Sarah nodded, understanding that Garrett had changed. Some battles left scars too deep to return to the way things were. But one thing was certain: whatever Garrett Cole did next, he would never stop fighting for the truth. This journey was never just about proving his innocence. It was about rediscovering his belief in justice, the very thing he had lost when he was betrayed. "Do you have any plans?" Sarah asked. Garrett glanced down at Koda, then let a small smile cross his face. "I think it's time I spent more of my days with the most loyal partner I've ever had." A few weeks later, Garrett and Koda stood outside the entrance of a specialized K-9 training center for veterans and retired officers. A former military handler, now the facility's director, extended a firm handshake. "We're glad to have you here, Garrett. Your experience will mean a lot to the soldiers who need a partner like Koda." Garrett smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Koda's ears. "I think it's time we give back. The way Koda helped me, maybe we can help others too." Koda licked his hand, his amber eyes shimmering with excitement. The road ahead was still unknown, but Garrett knew he and Koda had found a new purpose. No more running, no more fear, only a new mission, one where they could take everything they had learned, everything they had survived, and use it to bring hope to others. And that, Garrett realized, was what justice was truly about. The story of Garrett Cole and Koda is more than just a fight for justice. It is a testament to loyalty, resilience, and unwavering belief in the truth. From a framed officer to a relentless seeker of justice, Garrett never gave up, even when faced with betrayal, danger, and loss. But it was his courage, alongside the unwavering loyalty of Koda, that allowed him to expose those who manipulated the system and reclaim his honor. This story is also a lesson in faith, that no matter how overwhelming the darkness may seem, the light of truth will always find its way. What do you think about Garrett and Koda's journey? Do you believe that the bond between humans and animals has the power to change lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Dog Stories to experience more heartwarming tales of loyal dogs. We are committed to bringing you meaningful and inspiring stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a comment or drop an emoji to let us know you're here with us. Thank you for following this journey. See you in the next story.